So for this video we're going to make an HTML document that allows us to display thumbnail images. Each thumbnail image is going to have a label, and it will be the smaller version of a large image, and when you click on the small thumbnail in a separate tab it's going to open up that image for you to view. Okay, and we're also going to be using JavaScript to dynamically add additional thumbnails that we want. Okay, so as you see I have Adam open up here. We have a document called thumbnails.html. This is basically just the introductory HTML you need to create a document. The doc type, HTML tag, head, metacarset. We have the title, thumbnails, right? We have a style tag with the most basic CSS in here. We basically just made the margin 0 for the body element. And then we have the body element and a script tag at the bottom of the body element, and we have a little tiny bit of JavaScript in there. So we reload the page and we see application started there. Alright, so this is a good starting point. This would be a good template to start any HTML project. And we can go to start with a background color. Okay, and this particular project is going to be coffee themed, so we're going to select colors that are kind of brownish. So Adam has, if you go to the settings, packages, if you go to install, I've already installed this packages, so I'm looking under the packages section, but it's called Color Picker, and this allows you to open up a color picker to select different colors. It's a visual color picker, so we can try this out. So install that if you want, if you're using Adam. And what I want to do is hit Control Alt and C, and it opens up a color picker. And what I want to do is select something kind of that looks like coffee colored, right? So something around this area will be like a light cream color, right? And then press enter, right? And there's different ways you can create the color. If I don't want RGB, I can Control Alt C and go up and pick hex. If that's the type of output that I want, it'll show me the color in hex, right? And then I can go back to my kind of cream color, get a nice light cream. There we go. And reload the page. We've got a background color there. Alright, so this is going to be coffee themed, as I said, and we're going to have an area. First we need, we can have just a main div where we're going to put our content, right? Slash div, and this is going to be class main. Alright, and then for main, I might say that this is a div that has a width of 100%. I'm sorry, this should be, we'll say 80%. And then margin left, auto, and margin right, auto. We'll give it a little padding. On the top we'll say 30px, and on the sides we'll say 50px. And then we'll give it a border. So this will be a solid border. We will say it's 1px, and we can make a color and say, let's see, some sort of brownish color. Alright, I'll make that hex. And then border radius 30px. And we might as well make the color of our text this same brown color to go with our coffee theme. Alright, So we've added this, reload the page, and our div class main doesn't have any content in it, so it's not going to show up on the screen. So what we need to do is add some content, h1, and we have thumbnails. There you go. So we added an h tag inside of our main div there. Alright, so we can inspect the element and see what's going on here. We have class main. We have not gotten any of our elements styles in there, and that's because I did not add the dot selector here. Right? So this is the CSS selector. The dot means look for elements with the class, and then the name is main. Right? So this element has the class, which is the dot, and name is main. Before, when I do body, this is saying select all elements of tag name body. Okay, so there are no HTML elements that have a tag name of main, which is why this wasn't working. So we go back, we reload the page, and now we see we've got a nice rounded corner and border for our page. As we as we expand this, right, we see the width grow and shrink. We can make the width of the body element 100%. And as this grows and shrinks, we also want all the elements. We want to set box sizing to border box. That means you're setting the width to include the padding and the border. So when you set the width, it's not just the width of the content, you're setting the width of the content plus the padding plus the border. Alright, so now there we go. We've got, this looks a little bit better. So we set this to be a width of 80%, and so that width included the padding here and the border. That's why it looked differently before the border box. Alright, another thing we want to do is our h1 tag, we're going to say that this is class page heading. Right, and then we're going to center that text. So we use the dot CSS selector page heading, and we'll say text align center. Okay, what else? We might need a little margin on top of main. So margin top and bottom. We'll say that is, I don't know, 50px, and margin bottom, it's top right, bottom left. So I just moved those around a little bit. Margin bottom, I could say is 50px too. So these four properties, I didn't know I was going to use all four of them, so I can, instead of writing all four of them like that, I can just use one margin property, margin, and it starts with the top. You can say 50px, and then it goes clockwise. Oops. So margin 50px, and then the right is auto, because we're going clockwise. Then it goes to the bottom, which is 50px, and then clockwise would be margin left, which we want to be auto. So we can do that one property instead of those four. Okay, so we're adding margin top and margin bottom basically. So that gives us a little bit up here. So this is looking pretty good. We can set the main background color to be the same as the body here. Right, and then make the other background color this dark brown. There we go. And so we can add stuff as this main div grows with our content. We've just kind of got like a brown border around our main content. Okay, so that's kind of our main div. So we've got this h1 div here, and what I want to do is add a div that is for my controls. Right, and then I want to add a div that is for my thumbnails. All right, and to separate these two, I'm gonna put an HR tag, which is a horizontal rule. Okay, so we can reload the page and we can see it prints out this line separating the two divs. And I might want another one of those up here after my heading. Right? So I have my heading, and then in here I'm going to have my controls, and then underneath here is where I'm going to have my thumbnails. Okay, so we've got controls and thumbnails. Okay, so now to start with, each one of these thumbnails is going to be a display block. So it's going to be a little container that on top has a label, and then underneath the label is the image. Okay, so we're going to make a div, that's our container, so we'll call that thumbnail container. And then inside of that we're going to have a label, which is just going to be a text element. So we can just use a span, but we can say this is a class label or thumbnail label. You want to be specific with your names if you expect your page to get very large, because you don't want, if you use a generic name like label, the chances are someone else is going to use that name, or you'll want to use that name later. So you don't want your class names to collide with another individual's definitions, other class definitions, right? So we have span, and this is going to be our label, and our first label is steamy coffee, right? And then we're going to have a BR tag, and then underneath that we're going to have an image, and that is going to be one of these image here. So actually this first one is creamy, so this is the creamy coffee, and then the next one will be steamy. So the image source here is coffee-cream, and this is the image. Now notice that this image is very large. What we want is a thumbnail. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and add the large image, coffee cream.jpg. Alright, and we can add this, and we can just load the page to see where we're at. It's not loading the image. Coffee-cream.jpg, left off an E. There we go. Reload the page. So there, now we see. This is a great example. I love CSS, right? One of the images that I have is this coffee mug. CSS is awesome, right? CSS does some things that you wouldn't expect, right? This is exactly what's happening. The image is overflowing the size of our div, and instead of cutting it off, it just lays over the top. So it's kind of strange, the default behavior there. So that's fine. We can fix that. The easy way to fix that is specifying a standard width that we want all of these images to be. None of these images can be wider than what we specify here. So the width for all of these, we might say, is going to be 150. So what that's going to do is that's going to change the width, and it's going to maintain the aspect ratio of the image, meaning maintaining the scale factor. It's not going to squish the image down to 150 pixels but keep the same height. The amount that we've proportionally changed the width, it's going to proportionally change the height. Alright, so if we set a width here, the width will be 150, but we don't know what the height will be. It will depend on the aspect ratio. So if we save this, oh, that should be in the image tag. I'm sorry about that. Image tag, right? Because we're scaling the image. The width goes in the img tag. We save, reload the page, and now we see 150 pixels across. We have this image. We do have our label. That looks nice. The BR tag made this move to the next line. So we need to add a couple of styles to thumbnail container. All right, so let's add a couple of styles there. Dot thumbnail container, and we want to add a little bit of padding. We'll just say 10px should be enough. We can add a border, and that border is similar here. We probably want the same thing, same colors anyway. So border solid, and then brown, and border radius. We don't want 30 pixels, we want smaller, so we'll do like 10 pixels. Okay, and then kind of a margin between each one of these is going to be, we could say 10 pixels between each one, or on all sides, right? And then the last thing, most important thing here, is display inline block. That's going to allow these elements to flow one after the other. Okay, so when I add an additional item after this, it's going to flow to the right. Okay, and then I can have another item. Alright, so to test to see if that works, I can just copy and paste this. Right? Copy everything here, go to a new line and paste it, and I'll have two images that are the same, right? So we have to look into this because we want the images to be right next to each other. So we can inspect this element. It's thumbnails, display block is what it's saying. Okay, so let's see, thumbnails. So I copied too much, right? Thumbnails is the bigger div. What I actually want to copy is this and paste that. All right. So you see, I made a copy and mistake, or a copy and paste mistake here. What I really want is this, and I'm going to copy that because this is our thumbnail container that has the label and then the image. Right. I'm going to want multiples of this. Right. We reload the page, and now we get the correct effect. And as we add these, it should flow. They should wrap underneath. Okay, so instead of coffee cream, I can say this is steamy coffee, right? So creamy, and then steamy, and this is coffee steamy as the image. Right, we save that, reload. This is steamy coffee. Now notice the height on this one is different, and that's okay. But we might want to do a vertical alignment on this so that they're all top aligned, perhaps. Right, so thumbnail container, we can say vertical align top. So all of the items will be aligned at the top, right? So that looks kind of good. And as we add additional elements, we can add in our CSS is awesome item as well. So this is CSS is awesome. Okay, now the important thing to note here is that as I add each one of these elements, you see what I'm doing over here. I'm just copy and pasting a large amount, or a few HTML elements, not a large amount, but a few, and I'm changing two things. That's all. I'm copying and pasting and then changing two things. So what this tells me is anytime I want to add a new image, I really just need two pieces of data, right? I need to know what the label text is going to be, and I need to know what the URL to the image is going to be. if I have those two pieces of information, then I can add any number of these images down here. Okay, so that's really important, because when we add these controls in, we're going to add random images, and it's just going to accumulate down here. All right, so before we get to that, we need to make sure that when we click on these images, these are thumbnails, we need to associate the thumbnail when you click on it to go to a full-size version of that image. All right, so to do that is actually relatively simple. Around the image tag, we're going to make a link, an anchor tag. Okay. All right, and then anchor tags have the href. What are we going to link to? Well, the same image. Okay. And if we save this, remember we're just doing this to the first one right now. Reload the page. Now when I click on this, it goes to the full-size version. But I left my page, right? Close these out. I left my page, and I go back. I have to go back to go to my page, right? If I don't want to leave my page, in the a tag, I can add a property, target equals underscore blank. And that should open up this link in a new tab. Most browsers support this. It also depends on your browser settings whether or not it supports this, but by default most browsers support it. So I reload the page and I click on this, and we see it's now opened in another tab, and I can come back and click another, and it opens in another tab. All right, so this is one way to kind of do thumbnails. All right, so I added that a tag, and basically I need to do that to each one of these. So I can copy and paste the opening. I'll just copy and paste the whole thing and replace that. So this was coffee steamy. Change it in two places. Now still, we only need two pieces of information still. Even though we've reused coffeesteamy.jpg twice, we just need two pieces of information to create one of these thumbnail containers, right? And then we need one more here, and this one is the CSS is awesome. So we'll get rid of that and say CSS is awesome. CSS is awesome. Reload the page. Now each one of these will open in a new tab with the full-size version. Okay, so now we've got our display of these items. They all print out over here, and if this is large enough, they'll go side to side. So we could shrink these down a little bit, or if we want more items per page, right, we could make the width of the images a little bit smaller. We could say 125 on all of them. All right, 125. Reload the page, and we get a little bit more room that way. But you can make that whatever you want. So now we can kind of fit 3 per row. But now let's add the controls here. And what we're going to do, as I said, we only needed 2 pieces of information. We needed a label, and then we needed a URL, and we can add in a new one of these items. Okay. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get this thumbnails container, and then add to the inner HTML all of this stuff. And there's a couple different ways we could do that. All right, so we need to go to our JavaScript and create a function, and we'll call this add thumbnail. And this will be via inner HTML. Okay, there's going to be another way that we try to add the thumbnails. All right, so we're going to add a thumbnail using inner HTML. So how do we do this? Well, first we need to do a document.get element by class name, or elements by class name. The elements that we're looking for is thumbnails. There's only one, so we're going to grab that one, and this returns a list of items, right? Because it says elements, right? Get element by ID just returns one item. We don't have an ID on ours, so we're going to use thumbnails as the class name. There's only one of these, and so we can get the first item like that. Okay, so document get elements by class name. The class name is thumbnails, and this is referenced by index. We're grabbing the first element from the list because the indexing starts at 0. So this is thumbnails element, right? And we need to declare our variable. We can declare that with let for now. If you're not going to change the variable later, you could declare it with const. But starting out, we're just going to use let for most things. All right, so thumbnails element. This is our thumbnails element. And what we want to do to this is get the inner HTML. So we can say let HTML equal thumbnails element dot inner HTML. So this is the existing HTML. And then we want to add to it. So we're going to say HTML plus equals, and we're going to add in a string that's supposed to represent HTML. So the string value. There are 3 ways to make strings in JavaScript. I can use double quotes, which is one of the most common. You can use single quotes, have a string like that, or you can use backticks. Backticks are very nice because they allow you to interpolate other data into your string. If I have let x equals 5 up here, I can say the number is, use a $ and curly brackets and say x inside of, oops, there we go, x equals 5, so the variable is holding 5. I can make this string, the number is, and when I use this syntax here, the $ curly brackets, whatever I put inside the curly brackets, that gets evaluated by JavaScript and turned into a string and injected into this string. So this is going to say the number is, and then 5, but 5 as a string. Okay, so this is a really nice tool using backticks. It's called string interpolation, and you can add any number of variables in here. I can do this multiple times. I can even say x plus 1, for example, and add a JavaScript expression in here. So this is going to say the number is 5 space and then 6. So this is going to be handy for when we're constructing these thumbnail containers. Okay, so this is the div that we kind of want, but we have to make it a JavaScript string first, right? So we might have to escape some of the double quotation marks if we used a normal string. If we use backticks, we don't have to escape those. All right, so we're going to use the backticks to make our string, and let's just copy all of this and paste that in there. Okay, so this is our HTML, and what we want to do is we want to replace this with some sort of data that we get, right? We want some label, right? And then we want to replace this with some sort of URL. Okay, so I don't have these two things defined yet. I don't have a variable called label and I don't have a variable called URL. So I need to get those from someplace. Eventually I'm going to get them from some input controls up here. But right now I don't have them, so I'm just going to create variables called label and say this is hello, and then the URL URL equals, and we're going to say this is going to be http place kitten.com slash 800 by 600. Okay, so this is going to be a URL. That URL is going to get placed right here in this highlighted portion. Okay. So later what we're going to do is we're going to get this label from a text box, and we're going to get this URL from another text box. Alright, so this is add thumbnail via inner HTML. And so to get this to execute, we don't have a button or anything to get it to execute, so we're just going to have to run it ourselves down here. So this was the function definition. None of this code gets executed until we make a function call. So down here we're making the function call, and now the code is executing. Okay, so pause and take a look if you need to. Alright, we can reload the page. And let me save here. Application started, add thumbnail, inner.html. So let's start debugging why this didn't add anything. Console.log thumbnails element. Oh, I never added it to the thumbnails element. So I have the HTML, right? We got the HTML from the element, but then I never added it back into it. So we have thumbnails dot inner HTML, and we set that equal to HTML. Okay. I'm just going to move the HTML stuff all together, and then label and URL are up here. There we go. So that's looking good. Reload the page. Thumbnails is not defined. It's called thumbnails element. Okay. So when you read these errors, it's really important to see what it's saying. There's a reference error. It says thumbnails is not defined. So that means I used this variable, but it wasn't defined. Okay. So that's what I'm looking for, and it tells me where, what line of code we're working with, the page at 89. So here I had thumbnails, right? That's at line 89. It's really important that you can read this error output and determine where your code is failing. So the name of the variable is actually thumbnails element, right? I used a variable name that didn't exist in JavaScript. Correctly complained. So reload the page, and sure enough we get our label up here, and then we added this picture of the kitten, and we can click on that and it goes to the full screen view as well. Okay, so now what we want to do is, instead of adding this manually, we want the user to be able to have some controls here. You're going to need 2 input boxes and a button to actually add the item. Alright, so let's change this to, well, we're going to be changing that altogether. So first, in our controls section up here, what do we need? We need a label, and this label is going to say this is the label for our item, right? So there's a difference between an HTML element called a label, and then this is going to be the text labeling our input control, because the input control is going to give us a label for one of these thumbnails. So we could call it thumbnail label if we wanted to make it less confusing, but that adds length to the name, right? So we'll just call it label for now, and then we're going to need an input control. Okay, so inputs are void elements, so you can close them, self-close them with a slash. You don't have to, but they can't have children. All right, so you have an input of type text, right? And we could, if If we wanted to, we could add a placeholder, enter a label. Reload that page, label, we have placeholder text. The idea is they're going to type something in there. And then we need a second URL. This input has to have an ID because we have to get this input. The ID of this input is thumbnail label text box. All right, and we can copy and paste this entire thing, and this is going to be the URL, and this is going to be the thumbnail URL text box, and placeholder is enter an image URL. So we can reload that page. So if I click on this label, what the label does in HTML is if I click on it, it selects the input control. So if I click on URL, it highlights this input control. It gives it focus, is what that's called. All right. So I've got these two controls, and I need a button that's going to add the item. Okay, so I need finally a button. Type equals button. All right, and add thumbnail. So add thumbnail. So we've got a nice button in there, and we need to have an on click. This is going to be add thumbnail in our HTML. We'll say in our HTML on there as well, just so we know which one we're using, because we have one more type that we're going to use. So on click is the event handler. It's the click handler. So on this event, whatever the event is, this is a click event, we want to execute this JavaScript, right? So we always use a function and then call that function with no arguments. The only exception would be we can call it with the event argument, and we'll get into that later. But generally speaking, whenever you attach a click handler, you want to attach a function with no arguments and call that. Right, so we've created a button that's going to call add thumbnail in our HTML. So down here we need to get the information from our label text box and set it equal to this label variable, and we need to get the information from our URL text box and set it equal to URL, and then it will automatically create a thumbnail for us. Okay, so we can say document.get element by ID. This is element, just one element, so it's not going to return a list. And I want the ID for thumbnail label text box, right? This is the label. Okay, so get element by ID, thumbnail label text box. And I want the value from that control. So now that's going to be stored in our variable label. Then down here, same thing. I can just copy this exactly, and all I have to do is change the ID, because we're just getting another text box, but the ID is thumbnail URL text box, and then we're getting the value from that text box and storing it in URL. Okay, so I can reload the page. Right, we've got our controls here. Add thumbnail, so I can say this is kitty. replace kitten.com/800. That's the X pixels, the width in pixels, and then 600, which is the height in pixels. And click Add Thumbnail, and it does kitty, right? The reason we have this one here is because we forgot to remove that. Okay, so it was calling that, and it was trying to get this value, but there was nothing in there. So it went ahead and created one, but there's no image and there's no label, right? So reload that, do the same thing, and say right. I'm just copy and pasting that and add in the item, and if I click on it, it goes full screen. And I can add a bunch of them, right? And I can add different ones as well. Kitty 2, this would be 800, like that. Okay, and this would be the other kitty. All right, so that's how we can dynamically add HTML, right? But there's also another way we can do that from JavaScript. With this way, basically, we're creating the HTML using string values, and then the browser is rendering that string. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The second way we're going to do that is we're going to add thumbnail using JavaScript, right? So function add thumbnail using JavaScript element construction, right? That's kind of a long name, but we'll just say JavaScript. So we're going to construct the elements individually using JavaScript instead of using inner HTML, right? So that's the main idea. So we're creating a function called add thumbnail with JavaScript. Okay, so that's what we need. We're going to make another button here, so we can duplicate this button, and instead of add thumbnail inner HTML, we're going to say add thumbnail using JavaScript, and here we'll say JavaScript. Alright, so we're going to do basically the same thing, right? We need to get our container, just like we did here. We need to get our label and our URL, right? These 3 lines of code are going to be the same, so we can paste them in here. Now the difference here is we're going to create individual elements that's going to match this style HTML, right? So I'm going to use document.createElement. Okay, so we're going to say we need a div element. We're going to create a div element, and we're going to say document.createElement. What kind of element do we want to create? We want to create a div. Then we can say div element dot. Now what kind of attributes do we have on this div? Well, we have a class attribute, and we want to set that class attribute to a thumbnail container. So we want div element dot set attribute. The attribute we want to set is class, and we want to say the value should be thumbnail container, right? What other elements are we going to need? Well, we're going to need a span, a BR, an A, and an image tag. Okay. So let span element equal document.createElement. This is going to be a span. Well, what kind of attributes do we have? Class thumbnail label. Right. So this is going to be span element dot set attribute class. I'm going to set that to thumbnail label. Alright, we need a BR tag. document.createElement, kind, br, and let's see, we need the last one. Oh, we got two more. We need the a tag and the image tag. Okay, so let's create the image tag first. Let image element equal document.create element img, and then img element dot set attribute. We are setting the source attribute, and we're setting that to URL, right? So this is the first time we are using one of these two variables from up here, right? So we're going to set the URL there, and then we have our a element, our anchor element, and that's going to be document.get element by create element, and we are creating an a tag or an anchor element, and we want to see what kind of properties we have. So we have two attributes, right? So we have a target attribute and a href. So we say a element dot set attribute, and we have the target, the value of which is _blank. That allows us to click on the link and open in a new tab. And then the a element dot set attribute. This is going to be the href, or where we're linking, and the value here is going to be our URL. Right? This is what we got from the text box. Okay, so we've created all of these elements. Now the only thing left to do is to put them together, right? This div is the outer element, and these other ones go inside of it. The image tag goes inside of the a element. Okay, so what we can say is a element dot append child. So we're adding a child element. What child element? The image element. Okay, and then the rest of it is we use the div element dot append child, and append child adds it to the bottom of the list. Okay, so we want to add things in order, right? So we want to add the span, then the br, and then the a tag. Okay, so add child span element, and then we can copy that line and say the br element, and then add the last one, which is the a element. Okay, so this is constructing the individual elements using JavaScript, creating the elements manually, and up here we are using inner HTML. There are advantages to both. Okay, but it's good to know that you can do it both ways there. Alright, so let's save this and see if we made any mistakes. We probably did, but we'll double check that. So we've got add thumbnail with JavaScript there, reload the page, and we've got kitty and http://kitten.com/800/600. So we know this one works, and I'm going to try it with this one. Okay, we do have an error. I misspelled document. Okay, so that is on line 104, or let's see, yeah, 104. So we go down to line 104, document. I'm going to copy this, reload, paste that in. Got another error. Document is not defined. Oh, I put the U after. Alright. Add. Oh, and the last item, I didn't add the element to our thumbnails element. Right? So the very last thing we need to do is say thumbnails element dot append child, right? And this appends our div element, right? This div is the entire thing, right? Everything that we created so far. So this, since thumbnails element is already in our document, as soon as we add this div to an existing element in our document, then the browser is going to render it. So this is div element. Right? This is this item here that we added all these other things to. Now we're adding that to our thumbnails element. Right? Reload, kitty, paste, and there we go. So we're close. We left off the width property. Right? So let's add the width property on the image. So the image element, we need to set an attribute width to 125. Okay, and then there's something going on with our label. If we look at it, we can open this up. We have a span label, thumbnail label. So we've got, oh, we need to add the child text to our span. So we created the span, but we didn't add any child text, right? So to create child text, you can say let text node equal document dot create text node, and this is going to be label. And then we can say span element dot append child text node. All right. Reload the page. Oops. Span, there we go. Span element, span L, document.create text node, and that text node is going to be the label we got there. There we go. So now we see we've added it two different ways. There, as I said, there are advantages to both. This seems like a lot more code. But this already constructs the item before you add it. Where if you do it this way, then the browser has to basically do all of this manually and then render it. So you have a little bit more control over when that happens if you do it this way. Okay, so that is adding dynamic elements. We learned a little bit about thumbnails, sizing images, anchor tags, and having the anchors redirect to new tabs. And some dynamic controls. We have controls here, and we can dynamically add different elements to our web page. Okay, so that'll do it for this demo.